yesterday, Senior Fellow, Director of the South Asia Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. His primary research focus is on the political economy of India, and Milan examines issues including corruption, governance, state capacity, distributive politics, and electoral behavior. May we have Milan Vaishnav on stage. We have Peter Mayer, who comes across continents to be with us this morning. He's the Associate Professor of Politics and Visiting Research Fellow at the University of Adelaide. Received his doctorate from the University of Wisconsin, written on many aspects of Indian politics and economics, and is a frequent media commentator on South Asian issues. Join me in welcoming Peter Mayer on stage. And the chair is someone who we have heard yesterday, have also heard him being quoted on the previous panel. He's a writer and podcaster based in Mumbai, a prolific newspaper columnist, won the prestigious Bastia Prize for Journalism in 2007-15. Is that how it's pronounced? Thank you, Amit. Becoming the first person to win it twice. Also hosts a weekly podcast, The Seen and the Unseen. Please welcome Amit Verma. It's over to the chair now.
Hello, am I audible? Great, thank you. I'll speak from the chair because I am. So you know, one of the, I often say that the strongest force in behavior and politics is inertia. And this is especially true when it comes to government. That once we are stuck with a certain way of doing things and a certain system, it's very hard to break away from that. Which is why so many of us are so used to the first past the post system as a default way of thinking about democracy. And it sounds almost radical and revolutionary to actually talk about other electoral systems. But as many of the speakers during this conference have elaborated upon, there are grave problems with the first past the post system, which deal directly with the subject of the conference, which is money, power, and politics. Now, what I'd very briefly like to do is sort of, I think it's important if you're going to arrive at useful answers to ask the right questions. So I'm really going to attempt to ask three questions, three areas in which, I'm curious about the alternatives that can emerge. Number one is fairly obvious. I think we need to look at, if the problem with the first past the post system are the incentives in play, then we need to look at the incentives of whatever alternative system is proposed. And incentives not just with regard to the subject of, not just with how they affect money and power in politics, but also on a much wider scale of, let's say, understanding voter preferences, arrows and possibility theorem and all that, how how the incentives play out with party workers, party organizations, party cadres, workers, and so on. That's area number one of inquiry. My second point is that we should be careful about comparing the reality of one system versus the idealized notion of another system. We know the reality of first past the post. We know what it is in practice. I think it's dangerous to think of an idealized textbook version of another system and then discuss it only from there. And yes, it's true that all of these systems, proportional and so on, have been tried out in other countries such as Europe. But here I'd caution against what Land Pritchett calls isomorphic mimicry, which is when you transplant a policy from another country which has worked in those circumstances and you expect them to work in your own local circumstances where you have your own different conventions and ways of behaving and your local culture and all of that. So we sort of have to watch out for that and try to think of unintended consequences which might be unintended but can be foreseeable if we think hard enough about what could happen locally. And the third question obviously is the big question of the political economy. Why should politicians who are in power because of a particular kind of political system want to move away from it. Even if it's, even if it seems to make sense for them on paper, it's extremely, it is intuitive and natural for them to just play it safe and kind of stay where they are. How do we get these changes through in practice? So these are my three broad areas of concern. Because we have slightly restricted time, I'm going to forego the rest of the time allotted to me and just go straight to our speakers. Our speakers, unfortunately, now will only get 8 minutes each, because we have to wind up by 12:50. So at the 6-minute mark, I will helpfully remind them by holding up 2 fingers, which means 2 minutes left, and also victory for democracy, or victory for the chair. And shall we start with Mr. Reddy first?
Mr. Chairman, friends, there are 2 types of solutions. One is long-term, the other one is short-term. Long-term solutions, certainly, the proportional representation system with preferential vote is certainly the best. Nobody can deny that. But then we are concerned immediately with the short-term solutions. So I confine myself to what can be immediately done and confine myself to 8 minutes of time. Really difficult to speak in the second session of a second-day seminar, because many of the things which you wanted to see must have been said already by somebody or the other. But still, some of them are worth recalling and worth talking about for a second time. Now, as the states are becoming smaller and smaller, it is time we change over to a system of direct election of the chief minister with a fixed tenure. This is my first proposition. As I told you, there is a short-term solution, a long-term solution. This is a middle way. Let us start with this. Consequently, the office of MLA would not have much importance because he has no role in electing the chief minister. They can only become ministers. That's okay. We shouldn't grudge that. And elected representatives, MLAs, should be withdrawn from the boards or from the conferences, boards, and of all the local boards, Jilla Parishads or whatever we call them, different states and different names. So they should not have no representation in these organizations. This is one point I would like to say. We should have direct election of the chief minister. That itself would reduce corruption to a large extent, if not totally. There will be no floor casting by MLAs, and there will be no horse trading by the chief ministers. Both can be eliminated in one go. Second thing is, there is no need for legislative councils at the state level. This is a sixth finger. Practically, they serve no purpose. It only adds to wastage of public money. If necessary, perhaps we can increase the number of assembly seats rather than have this unnecessary organization called Legislative Council. Third point I would like to make is candidates should not be permitted from contesting from more than one constituency. This I understand is peculiar only to India. It doesn't, perhaps not there in other countries. There is no need for that here also. Why should they contest from 2 constituencies, again resign from one and create a by-election thing? This should also not be, it is not required, it can be done immediately. Coming to the parliamentary elections, Lok Sabha elections, only parties declared as national parties should be allowed to contest. Not all kinds of regional parties, because regional parties can only think regionally. They spoil the national perspective. So only people representing national parties alone should be eligible to contest for Lok Sabha seats. If a regional party wants to set up its candidates, it must enter into a pre-election coalition arrangement with a national party. Then only these people should be allowed to contest. Otherwise, there is no need, it's not necessary that we should allow them to contest in the national elections. Second important point I want to make is the election notification should be in 2 stages. First one should be issued 4 months in advance. 4 weeks in advance, 4 weeks in advance. The moment it is issued, the party in power should step down and governor should take over the administration. The present practice of the incumbent chief minister continuing in office through the elections is most undesirable. It led to unnecessary, avoidable, ugly situations even in the state of Andhra Pradesh here. The transfers of any controversial officers, if anything is to be done, that should be done by the governor. Maybe on the advice of the Election Commission or on his own also he can perhaps do it. From the time the first notification is issued, digital electioneering can go on. By political parties only, not individual candidates. Political parties can do this digital electioneering. They can organize talks on TVs, social media, that kind of things. A week later, second notification may be issued calling for nominations and scrutinizing them. The actual campaign should be limited only to 10 days. Because the longer the campaign, the more money you spend. Of course, just now we heard in the last session that last 2 days you spend a lot of money. But whatever it is, it should be limited to 10 days. In fact, one of the speakers yesterday in one of the sessions is a former minister and member of Lok Sabha also. He himself was advocating it should be limited. It is not required to have 2 weeks or 3 weeks in campaigns, because it means a lot of money and a lot of avoidable problems. Actual campaign time should be limited to 10 days. In these 10 days also, the governor in office may organize 3 public meetings in each constituency area, at which all the contesting candidates should be invited to speak. The meeting should be organized at the cost of the government, and contesting candidates should be asked to speak at these meetings, one after the other. Only 3 meetings should be organized. Maybe if he wants, he can organize more meetings also. I suggested 3. This is one. Then candidates or their representatives visiting homes of the electors and soliciting votes should be prohibited. It should not be permitted. They can campaign, they can do even road shows with the permission, but they should not be visiting electors and then soliciting votes. Candidates should not be permitted to mobilize people and come in a procession to file the nominations or to address a gathering. All this adds to the expenditure. Organizing a meeting these days costs a lot of money. The practice of employing polling agents may be abolished, because those polling agents, they were only serving the purpose of identifying the voters earlier. Now they can be identified in several ways. There is no need for polling agents. Road shows by the candidates may be permitted through the last 10 days only, and with the restriction that there should not be more than 5 vehicles in any convoy.
So last minute.
That?
1 minute.
1 minute. The present practice of having election time observers seems to serve no purpose. If they should continue, they may be given specific responsibilities and more powers, including, this is important, including checking government vehicles, particularly ambulances and police vehicles. Police vehicles also should be checked. They can be given the support of Central Police Forces. Advertorials, advertisements in both print and electronic media, all that should be regulated. even the so-called advertisements given by well-wishers should be counted against the election costs. And importantly, the Reserve Bank may stop immediately printing these 500, 1,000 and 2,000 currency notes. By 2024, none of these high denomination notes should be in circulation. If at all, they can have a 200 rupee note, not 2,000 rupee note. And another important point is the interference of courts after the election process starts. It should be stopped. Court should have no jurisdiction. Election Commission is a constitutional body, so they can manage this. Courts come in unnecessarily and then create occasionally create problems. This interference of courts should be restrained. These are the few points I wanted to make. I think I confined myself to 8 minutes of your time. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot. Now, may I call upon Mr. Mehta to have a go?
Well, 8 minutes is too short a time. All that powerful presentation, etc. made, but I'll try to summarize it in the talk only. There has been so much talk of direct election of the executive head of the government, what you call presidential democracy. The fundamental point which, is really not brought it out is that a truly democratic presidential system gives three choices as adopted in the USA. They have a direct choice to elect the head of the government. They have an independent choice to elect the member of the legislature. He need not be of the president's party. So this is, very, very important. We are bound, okay, Modi was popular. To elect Modi, the local level leader, local level candidate, his bona fides were not appealing to me, but still I was bound. And the third thing which we really miss is, we call Rajya Sabha, the upper house. We have absolutely no say in electing a Rajya Sabha member. They are all decided by the party bosses in Delhi or at the regional headquarters. What is people say? I do not know who is the member of Rajya Sabha in my state. Absolutely. Whereas there in USA, the Senate is the upper house and senator is elected by the entire votes of the state, direct election. He is another leader who can really keep a check on the president. And he can be again of a different party. So I have a choice to elect president who may be of one party, lower level who may be of other party, and upper house also can be of third. So you have three choices. Here what choice you have got? We just go and cast a vote for member of parliament. Now coming down to local level, how it will improve the governance. Of course, once the cabinet is also so different there. The cabinet is selected from the professionals and intellectuals who are knowledgeable in their field. They are not a part of legislature. And here what a mess we have made. Our legislators, they are not interested in real work of legislation. They are interested in the power. They want to get into the cabinet. Next to the cabinet, there are so many other posts. Presidents of the various, chairman of various corporations, they want those posts. And look at their caliber. The recent cabinet in Maharashtra, 43% cabinet is only metric pass. And about 50% of criminal record, the ministers. How do they deliver? Now coming to local level, mayor. Mayor is directly elected in all the cities. In Mumbai city, 15 million people, I belong to Mumbai. I have never voted for the executive head of the government at the local level. I'm only electing a councillor in my own constituency. Nobody knows the name of the mayor. He's a namesake mayor, ceremonial head, who just comes for 1 year. He has no accounting. Whole city of Mumbai, which is more value than any of the bigger states, has no leader. How will it deliver? Only the councillors are there. And these councillors also, they represent a small constituency. They don't have a vision of the city. Whereas the mayor, if he's directly elected with the vote of the entire city, will have a vision, and then he will have a freedom to elect the best team in his cabinet. That will deliver. The experts knowledgeable in the field of education, housing. They are knowledgeable people, and they are not linked to the legislature at the council level. Whereas here we have made a total mess. Okay, coming to the third thing, I try to cover it as fast as I. Sorry, because I'm down with the cold, but I try to cover it. The next is electoral reform. One of the biggest electoral reform we have missed is the candidates of national parties or all major parties, who is deciding these candidates? They are decided by the party bosses. Where is the involvement of the local, of the people in electing these candidates for the parties? There in USA, I don't say the system is perfect. We always want to criticize something, but look at the two comparisons. The party members themselves elect the candidates. The party bosses or the party caucus has no say. People elect the candidates. They say there are only two major parties all through in USA. Why? Because the people have participated in nominating the candidates. And here what has happened? There is a local level person who has done a very good work. But he has to be in the good books of the party bosses to get the nomination for either legislature or parliament or any other post or even a municipal councillor post. All these are decided by the party bosses. There is no people's participation. And there, USA also it was so. The party bosses became so powerful. You know, there is a local level boss who will decide the municipal council nominations, higher level, state level. There is a state boss, and then there is a national boss. Today, who will get the tickets in this one? The party bosses in Delhi, in BJP, whoever will be in their good books will get a preference. How can they decide the nomination of 540 candidates in less than 1.5 to 2 months? People should participate. So that election takes place much earlier. So there is a debate, there is a participation, and then what happens? These primaries came in USA only to break this nexus. The party bosses became so powerful that they will give the tickets. So all the chamchagiri, and then tickets are being given to those who have muscle power, who have money power, because they are the people who can influence. Whereas the good, honest people who are doing real good work at grassroots level, they will not have that kind of clout to get the tickets. Now, further down the line, we say, okay, so many parties have been floated. What is the major reason? Because good people, national level parties, Congress had an impeccable reputation at one point of time. Over a period of time, widely generated, because good, honest people found it difficult to get the nomination in the party for contesting at a local MLA level or MP level. And over a period of time, the degeneration went to such a level that it was like, you know, it became a party dynasty. I have a PowerPoint presentation I have shown. You see how this whole hierarchy, Nehru, Indira Gandhi, Rajiv Gandhi, Sonia Gandhi, Sanjay Gandhi, how this dynasty builds up. Because of this, if there is a participation of the people in electing the candidates, obviously, you know, this dynastic level will not be there. And then they have made open primary. See, there is a lot of freedom to the state, but primary is mandatory for all parties. It is under state supervision, and state conducts it. And there are so many flexible things states have adopted. For example, see, that also helps people to get involved in the party, this one, because they have a say. But some of the states have even gone to the extent, okay, you are not a member of any party. Still you want to participate in the primary. These elections are called primaries. Primary, you want to participate. You are not a member of Democratic or Republic Party. But still you can make a declaration. Okay, I want to vote for Democratic Party candidate in primary. I will not vote for the Republican. Only give the affidavit. You can participate. So this is where the democracy starts at the grassroots level. We say democracy is of the people, for the people, by the people. Whereas people say in electing the candidates itself at the grassroots level. No, that is over a period of time. Every party has degenerated. Say DMK, you know, like Karunanidhi, then his son, Kanimoi, all hierarchy going down the line, it continues. It has become like a, you know, old Rajasai. Every party, I can name it now. You know, the degeneration has taken place because the party tickets are distributed as per the whims and fancies of the party bosses. Now coming to you.
One more minute.
The mixed proportional representation. Yes, there are plus points of first past the post system. There are, plus points of proportional representation. But a country like Germany has been a very novel way, striking a balance between the two. 50% of the seats are allotted to the party on the first past the list, and 50% are distributed to the parties as per the percentage of votes polled by them. So it's a very good striking balance. Now, how much helpful it would be, I'll just give a very small example.
You'll have to wind up in 1 minute,
yeah,
sir.
No, very
Already
fast.
over.
How distortion has taken place in our system. In 1989, DMK, with a 33% vote, got 151 seats out of 232. Now the same DMK, in 1991, with a 21.4% vote, how many seats it got, you know? 1 seat. Only with a 10% reduction, 1/3 reduction, it has got only 0.5% of what is earlier. Another distortion, I tell you, with a small thing. Madhya Pradesh, I've got all the list, my book on presidential level, because it's an exhaustive research done, you know, all the facets. Madhya Pradesh, in 1998, Congress had secured 40.6% vote, and they got majority 172 seats out of 320. BJP in the same poll had 39.3% votes, and they had to remain in opposition because they got 119 seats only. Now, the balance goes away just with 0.5% vote. You are totally out of power, and with that 1% you are in power, you dictate, you command everything. And for the stability, as I pointed out, a truly democratic presidential system, yeah, provide stability, combine that with mixed proportional representation, and have a cabinet which will be independent from the legislature, and I'm sure, and now, of course, the primary system where people will participate. These are the 4 major reforms I would suggest which can bring about the change in the present depressing political scenario, because last 2 days we've been only hearing about election expenditure. But how that all illegitimate things have come? Because we don't want to reform our system, basically. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mehta, and apologies to all the speakers and all of you, because all these great ideas deserve much more time, but sadly we do have this restriction, so can't. Yeah, I realize that, so what can we do? We are restricted by this. Peter, would you like to go? Wherever you want, you can do it from the chair. Or there, or here. Sure.
Is that one okay?
Okay. Oh, I understand.
I'm just going to, we on? No. Yes? No? A thought experiment. If somebody wins an election by more than 50% of the vote, we have no problem with saying they're democratically elected. How about if somebody wins an election by 5% of the vote, and that's the largest amount, that's the plurality? Somehow we have a problem if 95% of the people have voted for some other candidate, but yours is the largest vote. And that is the well-known problem with first past the post voting. We've had critiques of it here at the conference. One of the strange things about first past the post voting in India is that it violates what's called in the political science Duverger's law. Duverger's law says in first past the post voting in a single member constituency, you should only have 2 parties contesting. Now we know that's not true. Here in Telangana, in the recent election in Nizamabad, I believe there were 183 candidates. Clearly, Duverger's law fails. Overall, and you can see it in this chart, basically, almost at no time until, in fact, this most recent election, has parties at the state level received 50% of the vote. If we go down to 1996, we can see that we are almost down around the 30% level. That seems to me is a democratic deficit, a problem that we need to rectify. One of the ways of doing it, keeping the single member constituency, not going at least immediately to proportional representation at the legislature level, is at least to bring in ranked order voting, preferential voting at the constituency level to ensure that at least a candidate wins by 50% plus of the votes. Can we have the next slide, please? Okay, here are 2 radar charts. This one from Madhya Pradesh. going from 2009, 2019. And what you can see is in 2009, you have a substantial number of people who win by less than 20% of the vote. Less than 30% of the vote. As we go to 2014, it increases. What's really interesting is the way the shift has occurred in this most recent election. So you actually have quite a large number of seats which were won by a majority. But if you go back over the years, increasing numbers of candidates have won by well less than 50% of the votes. Next slide, please, for Haryana. In Haryana, you had, well, it was 10%, but there are only 10 seats in Haryana, a candidate who won by less than 20% of the votes. Now, I don't think that's defensible in democratic terms. So what I really want to canvass is the possibilities of going for some sort of preferential vote at the constituency level, perhaps as a transitional measure to going to proportional representation at the parliamentary level. Okay, so you see the contentions, and we've canvassed them, and people in other sessions have talked about the problems of first past the post. So let's consider then what preferential voting does, and as you can see there, it guarantees that you have 50% plus of the votes. And I want to give you a couple of examples from my local constituency because they were available. That gives a sense of what it is. So in my local constituency, the winner would not have been elected in India. So can we look at the distribution? It's a bit hard to find out, but we're looking at particular two candidates at the extreme. Downer, who was a conservative from the Liberal Party, Sharkey, who ran as an independent. We have a Labour Party candidate, we have a Green candidate, and two sort of strange independents. The way preferential voting works in Australia and in most other places, the candidate with the fewest votes, first preference votes, is eliminated. So that's the first line, and you can see that Dowland is eliminated, her votes are distributed. Second line, Kane is eliminated, his votes mainly go to Downer, but not all. We go to the third level, the Green candidate's eliminated, most of her preferences go to Sharkey. The final distribution, the ALP people, the Labour Party voters, almost all of their votes go to Sharkey. And in the final wrap-up, you can see that Sharkey wins, even though in first preferences, she came second in the count. Can we go to the next slide, please? So the way it would be reported in Australia as a two-party preferred is when you come down to the end of it, which candidate overall is most preferred, and you can see Sharkey actually wins by about 55% of the vote. Okay, so what are the implications for India? What do people say about it? In the political science jargon, preferential voting minimizes Bayesian regret. Basically, what you're forced to do, as we all know, in a constituency where your candidate is not likely to win, you have to be a strategic voter. You may want to vote, hypothetically, for the Communist Party Marxist, but you decide to vote for the DMK or Samajwadi because you don't want to vote for the BJP. So you are already making those kind of choices as a voter. The advantage of preferential voting is that you don't have to make that choice. More importantly, in the literature on preferential voting are the social consequences, because in preferential voting, it's as important for you to get a second preference or even a third preference of a candidate as another candidate as your own first preferences. And so the need is to reach across constituencies, often to do preference swaps with other parties, but to actually try and build potential coalitions which, as the preference count goes on, will come your way. It leads to a social inclusiveness which you don't necessarily get in first past the post. It discourages negative campaigning because you actually want to say sometimes positive things about other candidates whose supporters you hope will reciprocate by giving you their preferences. One of the things that we haven't discussed much about in the conference so far is spoiler candidates. One of the reasons you put up candidates is to take votes away from your opponent. That doesn't work in preferential voting unless you think a spoiler candidate is going to bring votes to you. You don't get much by taking votes away from somebody else. And so the incentives for putting up dummy candidates and spoiler candidates is considerably reduced. That, of course, might have financial implications. It gives, at least in the Australian experience, power to other parties. If you are afraid that a party, either to your left or your right, but a competitor is likely to get the flow of preferences to you, what tends to happen is a party on the right moves further to the right, a party on the left moves farther to the left. So we see in Australia that the Labour Party has to accommodate, for instance, the Greens, if they want to attract reciprocal preferences from Green voters. Okay, I don't think proportional voting does much to cut down on campaign expenses. We've seen in all of these, there are a lot of legitimate expenses. What it does do is change where you spend your money. So if I can give you the example, and I'll give you a few concrete ones, are how to vote cards. Instead of just telling the people who you've fed and given booze to the night before, push button B with whatever my party symbol is, that's all you need to know. It's much more complicated because you need to say, yes, give first preference to me, second preference to so on, third preference to so on. So what you have is at the polling booth, your supporters are handing out how to vote cards. Now, Rebecca Sharkey, who won, you can see, had an interesting strategy. She only said, vote 1 for me, you can vote number 2 for anyone else, because she was hoping to get second preferences, which indeed she got, from other opponents. Here's her opponent, who's quite ideological in her preferences, so she gives her least preference, her 7th preference, to the Labour Party, and gives her 5th preference to Sharkey. So she has organized hers in a quite different, because she had a quite different strategy in how she was organizing her how to vote cards. I got roped into an NGO, which was a climate activist group called Get Up. We said, look, you can vote at least 3 different ways. The worst candidate to vote for is Downer. She's hopeless on the environment, but you could vote for Sharkey, you could vote for Byrne, you could vote for Jihadi. All of them are acceptable as, here's how you could do it. So we are in there advising people how they can organize their preferences. But voters actually don't pay a great deal of attention to these. One of my friends in the Electoral Commission says only about 30% of voters actually follow the party preference. But it's really important to be there at voting time to tell people how to vote. Okay, quickly on disadvantages. It's argued in the literature it reduces blackmail power. Actually, I think it's quite strong, as I've indicated before. Is it too complex? Because instead of just pushing one button, you actually have to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We all do that on our mobile phones. Preferential voting has been used in Fiji, in Papua New Guinea. We use it in remote Aboriginal communities. No one seems to have any difficulty with it. The only difficulty is if you have 183 candidates, as in Nizamabad, you're not going to be able to do what we require in Australia and list every candidate from 1 to 183. So you'll probably have to go for some sort of optional preferential system. And then the difficulty is some people's votes will be exhausted. If you only vote for 5 people and there are 183 candidates, it's very likely that your first preference, your lowest preference will never come up to a first preference. They will have been eliminated. And we may have to do some research about that. It reduces the need for and the incentives for strategic voting. You can vote for the party you want to in the hope that your second and third preference would come up to the top anyway. The evidence on turnout is mixed. And I was going to say something about turnout which is not in the presentation. One of the reasons it's come clear about giving handouts to voters is incentivizing them to vote. We had that problem after First World War in Australia. We solved it by saying not that we pay people to come, but we fine people who don't come. So I think one of the things we can consider in India is compulsory voting. I don't know what a suitable fine would be, 250 rupees, 500 rupees, if you don't vote. Maybe in that case you don't have to actually give people bribes to vote. if you have a penalty for not voting. Rich people will be happy to pay that, I'm sure, but you get nasty letters in Australia if you don't vote on the day.
Peter, 1 minute.
Okay. We will need new voting machines, but I'm sure there are people in Bangalore or Hyderabad who will easily convert existing voting machines into a sequential system rather than what we have now, one. It's said that one of the problems is that you require counting at a central location. That's not strictly true. The first count in Australia takes place at the polling booth with polling agents watching to make sure that the votes are valid and counted. But as in India, when you wait until all the phases are over and then the boxes are unlocked, I don't see that that's really an objection. Okay, it's kind of, what shall I say, audacious for a foreigner to recommend the voting system for India, but I think the failures, the obvious failures of first past the post are evident. Preferential voting could be a possible solution. It could certainly be an intermediate solution, which would be part of an eventual transition to preferential voting. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mayor. Miller?
Thanks, Amit, and thanks everyone for coming. I'm going to deviate somewhat from my fellow co-panelists and stipulate that the Constitution is not going to be reimagined anytime soon, at least not in these ways, perhaps in other ways, and try to limit my intervention to what might happen or could happen within the confines of the existing electoral rules. So I want to start out by stipulating what the issues are with the current realities of money in politics, and then what possibly could be done. Let me just start out by saying that when it comes to what has to be done, you know, it's not rocket science. You know, we basically know. We have several decades now of election commission recommendations, of law commission reports, of innumerable blue ribbon task forces, committees, expert groups, and so on and so forth. The problem, of course, is how do you get from point A to point B, and from where do you develop the political will? Now, what are the fundamental issues that exist with the current status quo? And I would submit to you all that there are essentially 4 cardinal facts about how money in politics operate in the current Indian environment. The first is that there is virtually zero transparency around political contributions. It is nearly impossible today to determine who is given money and who has received money, right? We know almost nothing about that. Number 2, we know that there's a lot of expenditure out there that is unreported. There's something called the rule of 10 in India, which is you take what's been declared, you multiply it by 10, and that gives you a ballpark figure of what's actually been spent. And this is something that numerous election commissioners have said now for multiple years. Number 3 is that there's no real honesty or clarity about political party accounts. And 4th and finally, according to the powers that it has under the Representation of the People Act, the Election Commission of India currently is badly outmatched and outdated in terms of its authorities to regulate campaign funding. So those are the 4 cardinal facts about what exists. No transparency, expenditure far exceeding the limits, no insight into party accounts, and the ECI, which is unable to keep up with the realities of funding. So the question is, what is to be done in each of these 4 areas? When it comes to the virtual lack of transparency on contributions, it's very clear that what we need to insist upon is 100% transparency on every rupee of political giving. After demonetization, in the Finance Bill of 2017, the government actually instituted a cap on cash donations at 2,000 rupees. You might ask why they didn't just eliminate cash giving altogether, right? After all, every citizen of this country, every resident, was asked to make some sacrifice, right? The vendor was asked to take Paytm, you and I were asked to change the way that we make payments. The one group in this country that was not asked to make any sacrifices whatsoever were political parties. They could continue operating precisely as they've always been doing, And it's ironic given that, in fact, they have the infrastructure and the setup to actually process digital payments. And now, with the near ubiquity of Aadhaar, you can link a payment to either someone's PAN number or their Aadhaar number. Furthermore, one thing the government didn't do, even though it reduced the limit to cash contributions to 2,000, which means that you can give under that limit, they did not change the disclosure requirement. So the disclosure requirement is still at 20,000 rupees, which means if someone gives 18,000 rupees, they're not supposed to give it in cash, but parties don't have to disclose where that money came from. So it might as well be in cash. So those are two massive loopholes that the government knew exactly what it was doing and chose not to fix them, despite the fact that otherwise cash was seen as verboten. Number two, when it comes to spending, I think it's been oft repeated from this stage that the present limits are farcical. Everyone knows that they're farcical, and that they should probably be either relaxed or done away with. But in exchange for that, there has to be some stepped up measures of enforcement when people spend either on illegal purposes or illegitimate ones. And here, there's actually an interesting institutional innovation from Brazil. So Brazil has a slightly different election commission. They have an electoral tribunal, which has some quasi-judicial functions. Brazil legislated that vote buying, or gift giving as I like to call it, is an electoral infraction, which allows the Election Commission of Brazil to actually prosecute and disqualify candidates if they're caught handing out money on the eve of a campaign. Now, that would change the nature of the Election Commission, but that's actually something which has helped to curtail this practice in another country and does away with the existing, or circumvents the existing backlog that we have in our judicial branch of government. The third issue when it comes to party accounts is very simple, which is that political parties, like so many other organizations, should have to submit to some kind of third-party audit. Right now, all political parties have to do is to get their in-house chartered accountant to give their own doctored accounts the Good Housekeeping seal of approval, and that's it. You could have the CNAG do an audit, or you could just have the CNAGs put out a list of approved auditors and insist that political parties, when they submit their accounts, have to choose one of these auditing firms. Last but not least, the Election Commission of India. Many of its authorities date back to the early 1950s when the Representation of the People Act was first legislated. And this has introduced a number of issues. So when it comes to, say, something like paid news, even when the Election Commission seeks to prosecute somebody who has paid for favorable coverage, the courts have pushed back, saying under the law, paid news is not specifically mentioned as a predicate for disqualification, right? So there are some changes which have to be made, including the fact that although the Election Commission can very easily register political parties, it has almost no authority to deregister them. So these are, I think, the four things that are wrong, four things that could be done. Now the question, of course, is under what conditions are we actually going to get any of these changes? And let me just end by stipulating four. The first is that I think there is a realization amongst many political parties that they don't have the organizational wherewithal to keep up with the costs of campaigning. Except for perhaps the ruling party today, almost all parties are in agreement about that. The second is that taking some of these reforms on actually could be hugely politically successful. I mean, think about the political and electoral benefits of demonetization to Prime Minister Modi. Whatever you might think about the success or lack of success about that reform, if you want to call it that, it was hugely politically successful. Even in 2019 on the campaign trail, many voters decided not to punish Mr. Modi for demonetization, but actually said at least he tried to take the boldest action on black money in 7 decades. Now again, we can fight over whether it was a good thing or a bad thing, but imagine if after demonetization in the spring of 2017, when this government presented its budget, it decided to push on some of these genuine aspects of electoral finance reform, they would have been wildly embraced and all of the opposition would have been placed on the back foot, right? So this is actually possible if someone wants to take it on. The final two things I'll mention is that if you talk to corporate business leaders, there is a certain amount of just corporate fatigue because the current system is highly extortionary, right? In order to get your license, your permit, your clearance, your change in land use certificate, you need to pony up resources, right? So there could actually be a situation in which corporate India is made an ally in this fight to reform campaign finance. The last thing I'll just mention, Amit, and then I'll stop, is judiciary. The few innovations and improvements we've had in election finance reform over the past decade and a half, almost 2 decades, a large number of them have come from judicial decisions. The idea now that, or the law that candidates have to disclose at the time of their nomination their financial assets and liabilities, their criminal antecedents, their educational qualifications, comes not from any political party, but from the fact that the Supreme Court took a decision that there was a right to know. Similarly, the fact that MPs or MLAs, if they're convicted by a court of law and they've not received a stay on that conviction, have to be disqualified immediately, is something which comes directly from the courts. Now, the courts currently are considering the issue of electoral bonds and whether or not they pass muster with the Constitution. We'll see how they rule in that case. But if there is a right to know when it comes to the antecedents of your candidates, surely there should be a right to know on what goes into your political party when it comes into funding, right? So I think that these are things which could take place without changing fundamentally the electoral design of India, but I think are very much possible, and in fact, people in this room, if they take them up, I think could actually push for some of these changes. So let me stop there.
Thanks, Milan. I've just been told that we can go on till 1 o'clock, so we have like 20 minutes of audience questions. I'll begin with one for Milan, though, carrying on from what you said about the point about transparency, that the danger of the contributions being transparent is that the ruling party then has the information on who is contributing to their opponents, and they can take vindictive action against them. So in fact, I would argue that transparency is freedom. Anonymity is freedom. So for the same logic that a vote can be anonymous, why should a contribution not be anonymous?
I guess, I just find it odd that the ruling party gives a different slant to this. Their argument for electoral bonds, which in my view just legitimizes opacity, is, well, corporations are worried that they'll be harassed. Your point is slightly different, which is the ruling party could take revenge. So why don't we actually deal with the fundamental issue, which is the arbitrary discretionary nature of the state when it comes to the economy, right? Nobody wants to deal with that issue of why it is that the state has such a heavy hand when it comes to the ease of doing business, when it comes to regulation, when it comes to matters of policy. I mean, that really is the fundamental nexus of how you, to go back to what Ram Madhavji said, get the state out of the economy. I think that's where we have to start, as opposed to dealing with these, what I would think are second and third order concerns.
I agree. In fact, reducing the power of the state, like I said yesterday, solves all our incentive problems. Yes, sir?
I suggest that this electoral bond, whatever donation comes, at least part of
I don't think
it,
it's on.
Sir, use this.
part of it should go for public funding. Like, why can the corporation, 50% of it goes to public funding, and 50% goes to the party. So this way there is a balance, Okay, this is always the ruling party is always going to dominate, and this is not the solution, And if a corporate is really afraid, it is an ideology which is matching with the opposition, why should they be afraid that they will be victimized? This is also something, we say democracy is not democracy. It is something like, you want to rule with the power. It's not democracy.
We'll cut to audience questions now. One request: one, they have to be questions, please don't make statements. Two, they have to relate to the subject at hand, which is electoral reforms. So not just the larger subject of money and power in politics. but electoral reforms per se. No statements, please. End with a question mark. Thank you. Do we have volunteers? Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So my question is to Milan and maybe Jashwant sir. So when we talk of electoral reforms and when we try to parallel them and see whether they'll operate or not, we do compare it with countries. I mean, for the last 1.5 days, we're talking of US and Canada as one of the primary comparisons that we are making in terms of how we are doing electoral reforms. But do we really think that only those models are the ones that we can compare, or are there any other models that are much Asian in nature, because we are closer as a culture to the Asian countries, that we can take a note of and then work on it?
My answer will be like, see, the liberal democracies, what I have quoted, they have evolved over a period of time. Whereas Asian democracy, like, still we are, like learning. What I said about that primary system came out of a reform because the party bosses had become so strong that, it was like there was no people's participation. Then the reform came much later on. Okay, yes, let the voters nominate the candidates. So party bosses hold, what you call the authoritarian, automatically got reduced, They started playing more positive role rather than dictating, Okay, yes, I will have tickets, the power with me. And see how many splits have taken place in our political parties only on this issue. And then after the split, somebody who gets elected as an independent or on other party, again he is offered in the same party. This is absolute farce of the democracy.
Milan, you have anything to say?
So just very quickly, I mentioned one innovation from Brazil. It's not an Asian country, but an effort that they undertook to try to deal with vote buying. Let me just mention one other thing, which is, Indonesia has a very powerful anti-corruption bureau. Now, unfortunately, the current establishment is not big fans of the Lokpal, to put it mildly, but having an authority with prosecutorial investigative powers would help act, I think, as a deterrent for the kind of insider dealing and quid pro quos that we see. Of course, there are some countries which have established public funding mechanisms, and we can talk about that more in the Q&A. I remain, and I think my friend Varun is going to disagree with me, highly skeptical that we're ready for that, unless there can be a grand bargain put into place where public funding is given in exchange for much more serious norms of transparency and much greater sanctioning authority by the electoral agency to ensure that good money isn't thrown after bad.
Right. That gentleman, do you have a microphone with you? Okay.
I have a mic.
Okay, you have a mic.
So, do any of the panelists foresee any electoral reform in the next 3 years, say till 2024, which is not a deform? That's one. And two, just to respond to Milan's skepticism on public funding. Public funding and transparency and a sanctioning authority go hand in hand. But for that, आप chronology समझिए. पहले public funding आएगा. Only then can you have transparency and sanctioning authority to scrutinize the public funding. So chronology समझिए. That's all.
And any ladies, the biggest problem in our politics is that there aren't enough women aren't empowered to sort of take part. So I'm going to, there's a lady there, kindly get a mic to her as well. And yeah. So no more mics for gentlemen, please. I'm going to be discriminatory here. All mics to ladies. Thank you. But you may ask.
So can I
please.
talk?
Yes, please.
Okay. So there are 2-3 points on the basis of the speakers which they have proposed. Number one, I have certain reservations.
Sir, I'm sorry. You cannot make a statement. You have to ask a question. We simply don't have time. It's unfair on the others.
No, I am taking independently.
I'm sorry. You have to ask a question.
No, I am asking questions.
Okay.
Okay. PR system, what we are suggesting for the legislature other than the executive, I feel it is quite contrary to the what we are suggesting for the leadership qualities for the executive. So my suggestion is PR system is in fact worse
Sir,
than
I'm
the...
sorry, I have to stop you there. There's no time for
Sir,
suggestions. We have
listen
10
to me,
minutes.
but this
We'll let
this
the
will be
lady ask,
useful
please.
to all. There are 2-3 points which I want.
I'm sorry, sir. It's unfair to everyone. This is a question session. Please ask questions.
What
Please
are
give
you
please
taking?
give the mics to the ladies, please. I must insist. Sir, this is a question our time. It's very unfair to the others. Please understand
I
that.
don't know, Mr. Verma, it is not a correct approach. I don't know, it is not a correct approach.
My brief is only questions, so I'm
also-
afraid.
This is not a correct approach.
Please feel free to give suggestions after the session, but let's.
No, I don't know. Suppression of things. No, I don't want. Let me say 2-3 things, please.
I'd rather empower the other people who are not getting a chance to speak, including the ladies. So can you please hand the mic to the lady? Thank you. One lady there, please ask.
Yeah, good afternoon. I'm Shravanti. Well, I'm also a politician, so this is a question that is, again, your illegitimate expenditure that you're talking about. You've been talking about so many reforms. Well, the one question that I have is post-election, when you're talking about defections, most of this are under financial consideration. That's an open statement. So couldn't something be done? See, we already have a law as per the People's Representation Act which talks about disqualification if someone is moving out. Say for the last election, in the last parliament, I would say there were just 2 MPs from the Congress party in Telangana. One defected. But then nothing happened. So don't you think there is something, a larger concern, because you've been seeing people defecting even in this parliament, the previous parliament, that's been happening time and again. Don't you think this would be one huge step, bringing in a new law or something, making the current law stringent, which would go a long way in the electoral reforms?
Anyone wish to take that?
This whole defection history has been going on for the last so many. We made that Anti-Defection Act, out of that only. Okay? Somebody defects, he loses his seat also. But then it encourages en masse defections. Okay? 1/3 of the party members, if they defect, it is not termed a defection. Okay. So what had happened was the smaller parties became vulnerable. Those who had, manipulation, those who had few members, 1/3, could be manipulated. Now this is an endless picture. And why these defections ultimately take place is because we have linked the cabinet with the legislature. By defection they are getting lot of benefits ultimately, whether, whatever the form, So if we delink cabinet, the separation of executive from the legislature, there is no, I have never heard in USA there is going to be a defection. Because why? By defection, what are they going to get? Even by remaining, in the same party, they have got an independent right to vote on any legislation. Okay, president's own party members can openly vote. Nothing like here. Okay, now in defection, see the negative. Now there is a whip, and anybody who votes against the whip of the party is also termed a defection. So by defection, we have created remedy worse than the disease, that Anti-Defection Act. The whole freedom of the legislature is also gone. So our democracy has, instead of reforming, we are deforming. With every reform, it is more of a deformation.
Thank you. The lady there, please.
Yeah, I'm Seema Joshi. I'm from Delhi. I'm a lawyer by profession. I just wanted to know from the panelists can reply this question. I think Milan has said that the donation is 2,000 rupees and disclosure is 20,000 rupees, 18,000, 19,000 I can give or whatever it is. See, the present government, if I talk about like that this is like if we they promote for online transactions and online transactions and all. So why can't we like EC or the government or the parties ensure that they should also, their account should also be linked with the online transaction, like more than 20,000 if they have to pay for the rally, for meeting, for whatever. That has to be on the way of an online transaction. So there will be less scope of using of illegitimate money during the elections, during the party, during the organizational structures, everywhere. Is it possible?
It's a good suggestion, you know. Okay, with online, you know, even their accounts should be made online so that everybody can access it. Okay, what the hell is happening? It's a very good suggestion.
If citizens are accountable, so should parties be.
I would just say that what you're saying is, in theory, completely in line with the thrust of the current move, which is digitization, formalization, right? We're doing GST, we're doing DMON, we're doing all these things, yet there is this special carve-out for this one group of entities known as political parties.
Shouldn't they also have to pay GST?
Okay, I only see gentleman hands. There's a gentleman hand. Yeah.
Sir, my question is for Peter Mayer, sir.
It's working, it's working.
So, PR was not implemented in India because the ranking order or PR was not implemented then because we were not that literate enough to understand the complexities. But now, do you think even the rural India can understand and PR or ranking order can be implemented in this present situation? Yeah, that is what I wanted.
Yes, thank you. I entirely agree. I mean, the experience of Fiji, Papua New Guinea, and as I said, Outback Australia shows that people at a similar level of education can easily handle it. And I have great faith in the intelligence of the Indian voter. I don't see any difficulty in bringing it in. And we get rid of at least one minor problem as part of electoral reform. Could I come in with one comment? At various points, Jai Prakash, but also Mr. Reddy have said that we should have direct election of chief executives, and I would caution as urgently as I could against that. Once you do that, you bring in a presidential type system. The executive will be from a different party than the legislature. It's almost a guarantee, a recipe for roadblock of the kind that you get in Washington. I think you'll be very ill-advised to abandon the parliamentary system where at least if you are the executive, you also have a party in power in the legislature. You can get your programs through rather than being blocked and stymied in the way that's happened over and over again in Washington in the last 20, 30 years.
As the only one on the panel who lives in Washington, you know, 2 words of caution, Donald Trump.
Okay, one final question.
About that proportional representation, I think the most successful example is Germany. They have combined 2 things. A minimum 5% votes should be there for the party to be eligible for 50% of the proportional representation seats. And 50% is the quota. So there is a balance. First past the post 50%, proportional, the percentage of votes is 50%. So the balance is really struck, you know, like.
Last question, gentleman in blue.
Check. Milan, to your point about giving more teeth to the Election Commission, the powers of the Election Commission only kick in once the model code of conduct is announced. The experience has been that most political parties make most of their expenses 6-7 months before the elections. For example, hiring political consultants, making the big payments to arrange logistics for each of those elections. Those are done before the model code of conduct kicks in, which is when Election Commission gets passed. Are there some reforms you can think of wherein the Election Commission can have some oversight even before the model code of conduct is announced?
It's a good question. I hadn't thought about that. I mean, I think the same sort of applies post-election in a way, in a slightly different way, which is, you know, once elections are announced and the winners are notified, that the 11 million people who work in a general election all disappear and you're back to the 400 or 500. And so when it comes to candidates not submitting their expenditure statements on time, discrepancies which arise, there's actually a very limited machinery to do any sort of follow-up. So I think it's worth thinking about, maybe pre-election, but certainly post-election, do you need a different kind of bureaucracy which is actually able to deal with the cleanup that happens post-election? Because otherwise, the EC sort of has to move on to the next thing, right? And inevitably in India, there's a state election coming in 3 to 6 months, and what's happened in the recent past is forgotten.
I would like to answer to this roadblock, you know, in presidential democracy. Let me tell you, having gone through the entire history of American legislature, there are so many instances where president has majority in both the houses. Roosevelt was the most striking example. Yet many of his legislations were blocked by the legislature. So it is the independence given to the legislature, the Senate and both the houses to vote independently of president. So you may be belonging to president's own party, but still you have full freedom to argue. The legislation is not voted on party lines. The full report goes to the entire house, and then there is a full freedom, absolutely no victimization. I am against president for what? I may be belonging to his own party. That is the real democracy. Here, where we have the democracy.
So I'd like to thank all the panelists and also all of you for being so patient. Economics is the study of human behavior under conditions of scarcity. We had a scarcity of time, so not everyone got to speak as much as they would have wanted. We couldn't take all the questions we would have wanted. I apologize for that. But all of us are around outside. You can accost us anytime as long as you promise no physical violence. Thank you so much.
Yeah, despite those challenging conditions, the panel did a good job, and I would request now the chair to felicitate and give tokens of gratitude to our two speakers who are yet to get the mementos. First to Mr. C. Anjaneya Reddy. Could you give the memento to Amit Verma so that he can hand it over? I request Shri Jaswant B. Mehta to do the honors for Peter Mayer. This way. Would like to take a couple of minutes to tell the audience that post-lunch you have the breakaway sessions, the parallel sessions, which you can make a choice for, of course. But sharp at 3:30, about here, yeah. So at 3:30 we start the concluding session, and that will also see Dr. Jayaprakash and also Shri Ashok Lavasa, Shri Ram Madhav, Shri K.C. Suri, Shri Ashwani Chhatre, and Shri Pradeep Chibbar, bringing out what is going to be called the Hyderabad Declaration. So we really look forward to that. And so make sure that you are here at 3:30 for the concluding session. For now, it is lunch till 1:45. So see you in your different sessions, the choices that you've made. So see you at 1:45. Enjoy your lunch. Thank you.